Hey guys, 116 episodes later, I am finally in the position to talk about my second big love after Pinot, Bordeaux. And 125 is not only the most successful and most listened to episode ever, it was also one of the episodes where I could have talked for hours because Bordeaux is so amazing. The history is absolutely amazing. Everything that came out of it is absolutely amazing. And if you are a true fan of wine, of the history behind wine, of culture, and of age-worthy wines, this is definitely your region to go to. Bordeaux, in my opinion, is the only region where, let's say, above 25 euro, if you pick a bottle, you can be almost sure that it can last for 10 years or longer. These wines are age-worthy, they are usually well made, and there is a lot of experience of crafting wines in the area. And I don't want to say that there are not other regions who are able to do so, but just talking about the average, it's one of the best regions. And I mean, my cellar is roughly, 60% consisting of Bordeaux. And every now and then I pick some bottles, put them in the rarity tasting, and share great wines with great people. And this is what I did last Friday, and it was called the Golden 70s. But golden was put in quotes. And why that is and what it really means to find a good bottle of the 1970s in Bordeaux, this is what this episode is all about. So have fun with the Golden 70s of Bordeaux. Welcome to the Pinot and Pixel podcast episode number 241, and this episode is Bordeaux time. Last week, there was this tasting I called the Golden 70s, and as I said, Golden 70s in quotes. Why is that? On the one side, no matter if it's the 70s, the 80s, or even the 60s or older, you need another palate for tasting wines like that. They are different. Usually they consist of tertiary aromas and even sometimes things you either haven't smelled before or maybe you don't want to smell. And some people say it smells moldy or, earthy or like a wine cellar or stuff like that. But if you get the chance to try some stuff like that and you get behind the idea of wines like that, you might like them. And this is how I found my love for wines, for Bordeaux. 12 years ago, I discovered a really old bottle of 1962, Clous Frères Sauternes, and I started reading about Bordeaux and dove deeper into this absolutely crazy history. And right now, my cellar is full of wines I want to share with great people, and this is what I do every 3 to 5 months. So last week was the time for the 70s, and to give you a feeling for the 70s in Bordeaux, it was a time where a lot was changing. Coming from the 60s, where the bigger part of the area on the vine was white, we were coming from 60%. There was a shift in the 70s because people were planting Cabernet, they were planting Merlot, and at the end of the 70s, we ended up with 30% white and 63% red. So there was this shift from white towards red. Secondly, the 70s were a decade with difficult weather conditions. There were some vintages that were really great, 1970, 1975 and 1978, some good ones, but there was a bunch load of really bad vintages, and even if you find a bottle of one of these vintages, you barely want to try that. But we will talk about that in a second. Another big thing that happened in the 70s was the oil crisis. And 1973, it brought inflation. The willingness to pay of people really changed. They didn't want to spend a lot of money on expensive wines. And to that time, compared to today, of course, they were cheap, but people didn't want to buy fine wine and expensive wine. So Bordeaux suffered a lot. And then they started heading towards mass production because they just needed wine they wanted to sell. So there was no green harvesting in the vineyard. There was a bunch load of grapes coming out of the vineyards, and the usage of chemical fertilizers was absolutely crazy. So the vineyards suffered, the soil suffered, and the people that were working in the vineyards suffered as well. Bordeaux experienced kind of a roller coaster on the other side, because coming from 1971 to 1972, the prices rose by 450%. So imagine coming from a bad vintage like 1971, the vintage 72 is even worse, but you have to raise your prices just, to stay in business, and people are still not interested in buying your wines. So this all led to also financial crisis in Bordeaux. And when the oil crisis came in 1970, the prices plumped, and, just Bordeaux was just suffering a lot. But this wasn't all that happened in 1970s. The famous family cruise I was talking about, and basically the story that brought me into wine, closer to wine, was the story of the famous négociants Crus, Fils et Frères. They have been in the game for over 110 years. And in 1973, they were charged for blending red wines from Bordeaux with cheap red stuff from the Languedoc area. They sold it, some people discovered the fraud, and then they were brought to prison, and in the end it resulted in the sale of some very famous wineries. One of them was Pontet Canet. The bottle of 1970 Pontet Canet we tasted was still labeled as Pontet Canet, Crus, Fils et Frères, and 5 years later it was sold because they needed the cash, and the reputation wasn't that good. And generally Pontet Canet is a winery that gained a lot of reputation with cellar changes in the 90s, but in the 70s, it all contributed to the bad feeling people had in the 1970s. And the next crisis came in 1976, the famous Judgment of Paris, when wines from Napa Valley, from the United States, were put in a blind tasting against the biggest, the greatest wines of France. So Chardonnay from Napa again versus Chardonnay from Burgundy, and the grape Napa caps against the Bordeaux blends of the left and the right bank. And guess what? The blind tasting ended in wins for the Americans. So a region that was already suffering so much suffered even more, and it was also the birth, or maybe even the rebirth. Well, let's say the birth of the famous Napa Valley Cabernets. But again, this wasn't the solution for Bordeaux. It even just contributed to the bad reputation. And finally, there was kind of a standardization happening in the vineyard with mass production, chemical fertilizers. But there was one thing that was quite funny and interesting. When I was buying collections and reading about the wines and the history, I discovered that some of the bottles weren't labeled with 750 milliliters, but 720, Pontet Canet, for example, or 730. I have a bottle of 1973 Chateau Giscourt over here, and this bottle says 73 centiliters. And I was like, why did that happen? Because, it's a 750 milliliters bottle. It is not. To give you some context, the 750 milliliters bottle is seen to be the perfect size for a wine bottle in so many different reasons. One of them is the serving size, so it's the perfect serving for maybe one or two people. If you don't listen to Winston Churchill, who said the Magnum bottle, so 1,500 milliliters, is the perfect size for two people if one isn't drinking. That's not the case. We are talking about normal, average wine drinkers. So this was the first fact. Secondly, a gallon is fitting 12 bottles of 750 milliliters in it. So you can produce 12 bottles out of 1 gallon, and it's still the perfect box case to being carried by one person, weight-wise. So this was another solution. And then there is this myth that the glass blowers who were producing the bottles had a lung volume that was hardly enough to produce one bottle with one single breath. And these glass blowers were advised to produce 750 milliliters bottles. So what did they do? They produced the bottles with 750 milliliters, like the one I'm just holding into the camera. The problem is, if you're producing bottles with 750 milliliters volume, there is no space for the cork. So you're filling the wines after you have produced them in the bottles and you realize, damn it, I can't fit 750 in it. So I have to label 730 because the rest is for a small amount of air and the cork. And in 1975, there was this European, what is the name again? The European Packaging Regulation that said the standard filling level for a bottle is 750 milliliters, so the glass blowers and the machines started producing bottles with 770 or 780 milliliters volume. So there was a shift in the mid-70s, and there are some bottles from the 1976, 77 where you can still see 730 milliliters on the bottle, but from then on, up in the 80s and ongoing, 750 milliliters is on the label. So this was the standardization, and this is short and briefly the history, the story of Bordeaux from the 1970s. And right now, I would like to have a look on the vintages. And before we start with that, there is a personal recommendation. I have a book, and this book is called The Vintage Guide 150 Years from 1870 to 2020, compiled by Neil Martin. This is one of the best books I have ever had in my life when it comes to history, about stories. The research for this book is absolutely stunning. And Neil Martin, he writes in such an interesting and also funny way, and I will give you some quotes later on, that it's so much fun to study Bordeaux even further. So unpaid advertisement, but this book is absolutely amazing. So talking about the vintages, and I mean, some of the information, I would say 80%, is from this book because it's well written. There is everything in it. He talks about the climate conditions, the weather conditions. He talks about the movies and the songs that were published in that area, and the great wines and the not so great wines, and the maybe some hidden gems you can discover when you dive deeper into Bordeaux. I would like to start with the poor vintages, the bad vintages, and 1972 was one of it. 1972 had a very, very wet summer with hail in August, reducing yields, and a very thin, boring wines in the end. So if you find wines from 1972, you should sell them because there's nothing of interest to try. I mean, I tried some of them, but even Neil Martin says there are not many great wines left to try. Even the big chateaus weren't able to produce great wines, and this will go through all of the vintage summaries in the next roughly 10 minutes, that the problem with the lack of concentration and that they weren't used to green harvesting resulted in very thin wines. And when you have rain like they had in Bordeaux in the 70s, and they had a lot of rain, then you have even thinner wines, and they are just not age-worthy. Always, there are some expectations, and if you dive deep enough, you might find some, and please always try bottles before throwing them away. They can actually surprise you. But 1972 has never surprised me, nor Neil Martin. Let's go over to 1974. It could have been a great year. It was great spring, great summer, perfect conditions. And in September, they saw 35 days of consistent rain. Isn't that crazy? 35 days, it was raining, so the grapes were diluted. They had swollen grapes, and in the end, you harvest thin wines. The wines feel tired. In the vertical tasting of Giscourt last year, we had a 1974, and there were two people from 1974, and they quite liked it, but you know, it was more like the love for the winery and the vintage rather than for the wine itself. So, you know, I can remember 1974 Duat Millon, and I was talking to a friend, Marcus, about that recently in the tasting on Friday, and he also said 1974, no, not a vintage to remember. And these were the vintages we skipped on Friday as well. There might have been surprises, but there weren't any in my cellar, so I just skipped them. The third year that was pretty bad was 1971. Rain during flowering, hail in June, a storm in August, and then a hot summer, resulting in lower yields and low acidity and no concentration. So this is actually nothing you're looking for when you're looking for a great wine or even just a wine to drink easily on the terrace or so. So there might be some exceptions. I heard some people say that Chateau Margaux, for example, is a great wine from that vintage, but also depending on, the filling level and the storing conditions. But, you never know. So keep your eyes open, but I won't recommend to buy 1971. If you're looking for Bordeaux, if you're looking for a vintage wine in 1971, go for a Riesling from Germany. Riesling was amazing. Germany had an amazing vintage in 71, and there were some really great Rieslings coming out of it. Let's get over to the worst vintage in the 70s and maybe even in the last, 60 or 70 years. 1977. And I have some friends who come to some of my tastings every now and then, and they really love old wines, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Barolo, Brunello. So they know how to taste, and they are born in 1977. And I have one bottle of 1977 in my cellar, and I keep it for them, and I will share it with them. But I think, I don't want to spoiler that, but I think it won't be a surprise. But nevertheless, 1977, just to give you an overview, Neil Martin says it's the low light of a bad decade, cold winter, heavy frost, mildew, and a lot of rain. The perfect conditions during harvest couldn't compensate anything. The wines, some of them were chaptalized, even lasted very long. So, for example, one of the guys that was really great in tasting wines was Michael Broadbent. I have some amazing books of this guy. And his notes from the 80s already said that you better not look for 1977 wines. And my favorite quote from Neil Martin's book is for the vintage 1977, and I want to read it to you. The 77 vintage produced a gamut of claret, so the thin red stuff, that often tastes as bad as the weather that year. Those with masochistic tendencies might find some self-inflicted pleasure, but they might also find their senses assaulted by fetid aromatics and flavors not far from that of rotten cabbage. I have suffered a handful. It's part of the job. The best is 1977 La Mission Aubryon or perhaps La Fleur. Requesting Veronique Sanders to open her most challenging vintage, she obliged with 1977 Aubailly that glimmered for a few minutes before oxygen kicked away both of its walking sticks. A bottle of 1977 La Conseillante clung onto life by its fingernails, and an ex-Chateau Magnum bottle, better to store, of 1977 Cos Laborie at the annual Académie du Vin dinner made me wish for a smaller format, preferably one called non-existence, but kudos for having the guts to open it. This is how Neil Martin talks about 1977, so, well, just skip that vintage, guys. But if you want to be part of the tasting with the 1977 bottle, send me an email at podcast@pinotpixel.com. I don't know, maybe you have some masochistic tendencies, so you're happily invited. So right now, we get to the better vintages. And 1976 was a perfect vintage on paper. So talking about the perfect vintage in Bordeaux. Usually mild winter, then a normal, not too cold, not too warm spring, some rain, so the soil can soak up some rain for the upcoming summer, perfect flowering, and then mild May, June, a hot summer to get some concentration in the grapes, get the alcohol levels you need, and then maybe a hint of rain in August just to get away from this, stress from the water stress, and then perfect conditions in September for harvesting. This is the perfect vintage in Bordeaux. And this all happened in 1976. And then they had 4 days of really intense rain. And I'm talking about 25% of the whole rain of a usual season in Bordeaux. And this destroyed almost every hope for a great vintage, diluted grapes, swollen grapes, and then resulting in wines that were very, very edgy and low in acidity because it was a hot summer. Some experts even call the vintage the donut year because the wines feel like they have a lot of power, but they're quite hollow in the middle. And this is nothing you want to taste. My biggest surprise of this vintage was actually Chateau Lascombe. I had this several times. It was part of an original wooden case, and I had one bottle in that tasting on Friday, and it was actually a really, really nice wine. Tertiary aromas, but still there was body, there were balanced tannins. There was an acidity level that was quite impressive, actually. So it was a very enjoyable wine, and it started, let's say, the reign of some really good bottles that night. The next vintage, and one of my biggest surprises on Friday, was 1973. 1973 had a good spring and summer, but also, again, heavy rain in September that killed every hope for a perfect year. Nevertheless, some wineries really managed to get some good wines in the cellar. And again, green harvesting would have made 1973 a great year. But it didn't. So it didn't exist. So, again, it was just average grapes. But every now and then you find a hidden gem. And this is what I did and what the people did on Friday. 1973 Chateau Giscourt. Disclaimer, I love this winery. It's my favorite winery. It's my favorite wine. And I have never been disappointed by Chateau Giscourt. It's always a pleasure to drink stuff like that. And having a bottle of an average vintage like 1973 that was so elegant and so easy, and you have this hint of some floral notes, and you just lean back and enjoy it. And again, I might be a bit biased, but there were some people that actually said the same and really enjoyed that bottle. And guess what? There is one left in my cellar. So if you know somebody that wants to share it, 1973, you know what you have to do. So right now, the better vintages are coming. 1979. Good conditions, actually really good conditions, but again, very high yield. So you have a lot of wine available. There are many bottles of 1979 in the market, but a lack of concentration. They are not like super full in body, but there can be some really nice, interesting wines. We had a 1979 Prior Lichin, which has an amazing story as a winery, Alexis Lichin. But this is another story. And this was also a wine I started the tasting with because it wasn't tired, but it was just, it was there. It was nice to have it in the beginning and to climb some steps further on, but it was nothing super exciting. More exciting was 1978. This is the third best vintage of the 70s. And Clive Coates, Master of Wine, said everything went wrong until August. So rain, frost, whatever could happen, mildew. But then they had an Indian summer. And the Indian summer actually really saved the vintage and brought out some good, maybe even great wines. And I had several. 1978s, I can remember Chateau d'Ozac, which is a smaller winery in Margaux, but this was an excellent wine, actually. And okay, again, Giscourt, I have had, I don't know how many bottles of 1978 Giscourt. It's the vintage of the marriage of my parents, and we had some wines together, one for Christmas 2 years ago, and it's just a great wine. So maybe Margaux is the region where you should have an eye on if you're looking for some great wines of 1978. Actually, the whole left bank was really good in 1978. And Sauternes, because they had an autumn, a fall that was quite, wet. But this is actually really good for botrytis, resulting in a very good vintage for Sauternes. So if you are a fan of sweet wines, maybe 1978 might be a thing for you. And it was even so good, condition-wise, for Sauternes, that Doisy d'Aen harvested ice wine at the end of the year. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a bottle, but just that I've said it, isn't that amazing? I really love that. So let's head over to the best vintages of the 70s. And actually, these two vintages also brought the two best wines to the tasting table. We start with 1975. Spring frosts reduced the yields, which is basically not bad if you're looking for higher concentration. I mean, some wineries don't like that, of course, because it reduces yields and then it can be an economic factor for your company. But as a wine enthusiast, this is not a bad thing. They had a great summer. August and September had a lot of rain, and then the problem came. The left bank was so afraid of the rain that they harvested earlier. And what you usually have as a result is wines with high acidity, harsh tannins. They are not fully ripened, so sometimes they are a bit bitter. And, they don't have this concentration you might expect from a great Bordeaux. And secondly, when you drink those wines, even if they age, they're still a bit rough. So opening left bank Bordeaux from the 1975 vintage, they sometimes feel a bit edgy and harsh, and you just have to pass the tannins and taste the wine behind them. And then you might find some interesting wines. But the right bank was absolutely stunning. And the wine of the night of the tasting on Friday was Chateau Canon. It's probably one of the nicest aged wines I've ever tasted from the right bank. And I mean, I'm not the Petrus drinker or something like that. I just can't afford it, and I just don't want to, actually. Chateau Canon is a very affordable wine still, and this 1975 wine was really, really great. The bottle was in perfect condition. It had filling level into neck, so almost high filling, like they were produced at that time. Juicy, fruity, concentrated, and it was just a pleasure to drink that. And I would even claim that if you find some bottles, you can keep them for 2 or 3 years. Do you have to? No, but you could. The wine maybe it won't get better, but it's still enjoyable in some years. But it needs perfect conditions, and who knows that? Sometimes it's just like playing the lottery. And last but not least, 1970, and I was so excited for this vintage because I have so many bottles of 1970 in my cellar. It's a great vintage, and people, some people are afraid of 1970 because, I mean, the wines are already 55 years old, and there are only few wineries that could manage to bring wines like this over 55 years to your table. 2 weeks ago, I had a Spätburgunder, a Pinot Noir from Germany. Today it's called Kloster Eberbach. At that time, it was the federal winery of Eltville or Hessen. I can't remember the exact translation in English. Staatsweingüter Eltville. And this wine was amazing. Assmannshauser Höllenberg, one of the greatest vineyard sites in Germany. 1970 Pinot Noir. This is how Pinot should taste. But sorry, we want to talk about Bordeaux. So 1970, perfect season. And if green harvesting would have been invented already, it would be in a line with 1961, 1982, 1989, and 1990. But they haven't. So some of the wines are, part of a mass production cycle, and they lack a bit of concentration, but they are age-worthy. And we had 3 different wines in the tasting of 1970. A Pontet Canet, I was already talking about, from Crus Fils et Frères. A Chateau Talbot, one of my favorite wines. They have almost never disappointed me, no matter what vintage we are talking about. And I can highly recommend Chateau Talbot. Pauillac, if you love graphite. So if you take a pencil and just draw some lines on a paper and then you smell it, this is what Chateau Talbot should smell like, So Chateau Talbot was the second one. And then we had Chateau Margaux. And guess what? The most expensive wine of the night, Chateau Margaux, was absolutely disappointing. It was tired, it was thin, light, and it was okay, it was drinkable, but this is neither something you would expect from a great wine generally, rather than from a wine you could have spent 300, 400 euro on. And this is what I usually try to tell people. If it's not for gifting a bottle of, 1970 in that case, to someone who was born in 1970, just to show this is a bottle with their vintage on, if they really want to drink it, it's lottery. And maybe you read a bit, buy a book like this, browse the internet. Don't ask ChatGPT because this is not good at all. If you want to work with rarity wines, there's only few documentation on that. So read some books and try to find hidden gems sitting between maybe 50 to 100 euro. And the Pontet Canet, for example, you can get for 90 euro. And I had talked to a colleague who told me that he was tasting some Pontet Canets from the 70s and he was disappointed. I loved the bottle of Pontet Canet and it came to second place that night. People loved it. Actually, unfortunately, it was the last bottle I had in my cellar, but there were 6 of them and I enjoyed every single one. To wrap this up, the 1970s, not a golden age, not a golden decade, but some interesting wines, great stories, ups and downs, of course, but this is what history and storytelling makes exciting, doesn't it? And then there were some great wines, and I would say from the 11 wines we've tasted in the end, 4 to 5 were really great. Some of them were good, and some were just like, for the experience. Think about it. If you're looking for a great bottle, research, taste a lot. If you go to the tasting, come with another palate. And if you're looking for some great wines out of Bordeaux, you want to give to a person or so, do some research, send me an email at podcast@pinotpixel.com. I would love to share some bottles of my cellar. And right now, have an absolutely great week. Read some articles on Bordeaux. See you on Saturday with the weekly update. Ciao, ciao.